Beneath the scorching North African sun, they had trudged across the sand, adhering to directives they barely had faith in anymore, when their capture occurred swiftly and with minimal opposition. For countless Italian soldiers, surrendering to the Allied forces felt not so much like a disgrace, but more akin to a peculiar sense of liberation, as Mussolini's assurances of triumph had long since crumbled. However, what they did not anticipate was that their experience as captives would not conclude in desolate desert enclosures, but rather across the extensive Atlantic Ocean in the very core of the United States. Gossip circulated rapidly within the improvised detention centers of Tunisia and Algeria. Certain individuals would be relocated overseas, distant from the conflict. The majority ridiculed the notion. They envisioned metal cages, unending chains, perhaps deprivation and mistreatment at the hands of the foe. Propaganda had portrayed the Americans as corrupt, pitiless capitalists who prospered on cruelty. Nevertheless, when the transport vessels ultimately arrived and the men were ushered onto troop carriers under close surveillance, they discerned that something unforeseen was transpiring. The journey itself was lengthy, at times alarming, as submarine threats lingered in the Atlantic. Yet the circumstances were already superior to what they had envisioned. Each individual received sustenance, medical evaluations, and even pristine uniforms emblazoned with the prominent letters PW. Initially, they were apprehensive. This must be some deception, surely. However, the discipline of their sentinels was firm, yet not merciless. The Americans did not assault or starve them. Numerous prisoners recalled that juncture as the initial fissure in the edifice of fabricated fascist narratives they had been fed for years. Supposing the adversary treated them so contrastingly from what Mussolini had cautioned, what else might be untrue? As the initial vessels docked at harbors such as Norfolk, Virginia, or New York, throngs of American citizens occasionally congregated at a distance, curious to catch sight of these Italians who had previously fought under Hitler's banner. Soldiers escorted the captives to trains that would convey them inland. The Italian men gazed out the windows as America unfolded. Unending thoroughfares, tidy diminutive residences with white picket fences, fields extending toward the horizon, all untouched by explosions or warfare. In contrast to the devastated terrains of Europe, here everything appeared affluent, structured, and oddly tranquil. For numerous individuals, it was their initial genuine glimpse of America, and it diverged greatly from the monstrous depiction fascist propaganda had portrayed. The camps themselves were yet another jolt. Instead of thorny wire confines in the wilderness, they encountered rows of timber barracks, immaculate mess halls, and orderly recreational courtyards. Each captive was allocated a bunk, a covering, and consistent meals. The Geneva Conventions, so frequently disregarded in Europe, were actually enforced here. Even physicians examined them upon arrival, tending to injuries or infections without hesitation. Certain prisoners later documented that the Americans appeared resolved to demonstrate they were not the brutes fascist officials had alleged. At nighttime, as the Italian men reclined in their bunks, they murmured to one another regarding the oddity of their destiny. They anticipated suffering, starvation, or perhaps even their demise. Instead, their living situation resembled familiar military accommodations, surpassing even the hardships endured by numerous Italian soldiers on the front lines. The older, seasoned soldiers expressed doubt, whispering that such comfort could not persist, and that inevitable mistreatment would surface shortly. However, the younger individuals cautiously began to envision surviving the war while preserving their dignity. Their imprisonment was evolving into something unbelievable back in Italy. An unforeseen act of compassion within a world overwhelmed by brutality. The initial impressions of these camps were merely the beginning. As the Italians adapted to their novel surroundings, the stark realities of captive life unfolded in ways that astonished them further. They had steeled themselves for the sight of barbed wire and armed guards brandishing clubs. However, what they encountered was a well-organized system that was surprisingly humane. The living quarters consisted of basic wooden structures, often swiftly assembled to house the sudden influx of prisoners, yet they proved to be sturdy, dry, and kept warm throughout winter with the use of coal-burning stoves. To men who had faced the scorching heat of Libya or the frigid mountain fronts of Greece, such shelter seemed like an unexpected and extravagant luxury. Upon their arrival, each prisoner underwent a medical evaluation. American physicians checked for the presence of lice, tuberculosis, malnutrition, and untreated wounds acquired during the chaotic desert warfare. Initially suspicious, some Italians questioned whether these examinations might be a facade for experimentation or maltreatment. Instead, they were given medication, vaccinations, and, in certain instances, even dental work that they had never experienced in their homeland. One former prisoner later confessed that it was the first occasion in his life that a doctor had examined his mouth to address a decaying tooth. Though seemingly a minor act, it held immense significance for men who had anticipated contempt. Food rapidly became another unforgettable surprise. The mess halls of each camp adhered to standard army rations, with only minor adjustments made to accommodate the dietary preferences of foreign prisoners. Italians accustomed to food shortages and rationing back home were now receiving regular portions of bread, meat, beans, coffee, and even fruit in sufficient quantities. Although the meals did not consist of their customary pasta and olive oil, the sheer abundance of food left many in a state of disbelief. They were being fed better as prisoners of war than they had been as soldiers under Mussolini's command. Some jokingly remarked that had they known American captivity entailed such meals, they might have surrendered earlier. Others, more solemnly, quietly felt ashamed, as they realized that the enemy treated them more generously than their own leaders had. The guards, too, defied expectations. They were strict, and any attempts to escape were met with confinement or the loss of privileges, but they were rarely brutal. Most American soldiers assigned to guard duty harbored no particular animosity toward the Italians. In fact, some treated them with a nonchalant friendliness that surprised the prisoners. Although they remained enemies, they were not the monstrous figures Mussolini had depicted. This everyday display of civility eroded the ingrained fear that had been instilled in them. The orderly environment and sense of normalcy were the most surprising aspects for the captured soldiers. The camps functioned similarly to small towns, with set schedules, routine checks, assigned duties, and allotted time for leisure. The prisoners were able to set up football games, play cards, and even enjoy music on radios, though supervised by the guards. The structured leisure activities seemed nearly unbelievable for the Italians, especially those who had come from impoverished villages. They gradually started to feel less like prisoners in a foreign land, and more like individuals briefly paused from the conflict. Although screened, letters from home were allowed, and many prisoners valued the opportunity to communicate with their families, reassuring them of their well-being and decent treatment. Some even feared their families might doubt their accounts of American kindness, considering the grim tales circulating throughout wartime Europe. The Italians came to understand, after their initial months, that their imprisonment was not a horrible ordeal but rather something quite unexpected. America had not broken their spirit through harshness. Instead, it had shown a form of strict leniency. This understanding made them uneasy, yet it also sowed seeds of thankfulness that they couldn't dismiss. As the weeks changed into months, a consistent daily pattern emerged in the American camps. The surprisingly humane and organized nature of their daily schedules was most remarkable to the Italians. The day typically began with a morning roll call, followed by breakfast in the dining hall, where they were given servings of eggs, porridge, or cornbread. While not the Mediterranean cuisine they were accustomed to, it was plentiful and consistent. The regular meals felt like a subtle luxury for men accustomed to constant shortages in Italy and at the front lines. Following breakfast, prisoners were given different tasks within the camp, ranging from cleaning living quarters and maintaining fences, to assisting in the kitchens or helping with repairs. Although technically prisoners, they were neither shackled nor degraded. The work was intended to keep the men engaged, and those who fulfilled their duties satisfactorily often received privileges like additional recreational time. Many Italians observed that the Americans seemed committed to upholding order without resorting to brutality, a contrast to the strict punishments common in Axis military discipline, which made a significant impact. Recreation was yet another unexpected surprise. Camps frequently organized soccer matches, baseball games, and even theatrical productions put on by the prisoners themselves. The Italian prisoners of war, many of whom had grown up loving soccer, were excited to have the opportunity to play. Some camps even permitted mixed games, with guards participating, blurring the distinction between captors and captives for a short while. It was surreal for men who had once faced these same Americans on the battlefield to now be passing a ball together under the summer sun. Education became one of the most notable elements of camp life. In accordance with the guidelines set forth by the Geneva Convention, the U.S. Army extended educational opportunities to its prisoners of war by allowing them to attend different classes. Italian officers and other educated prisoners took the initiative to conduct lectures in areas such as mathematics, languages, and literature. The American authorities even provided the necessary textbooks for these classes. For some of the young and men who had grown up on farms in southern Italy, this represented their inaugural experience of organized formal schooling. In a strange twist, the prison environment evolved into a space for education and personal growth. As years passed, numerous veterans from these internment camps would acknowledge that their time spent in American captivity broadened their perspectives, far beyond the limited scope offered by life in fascist Italy. Religious observance was also held in high regard. Catholic chaplains would sometimes pay visits, and the prisoners had permission to arrange their own religious services on Sundays. The sound of hymns sung in Italian resonated within the camp, chapels, or in makeshift outdoor areas, instilling a feeling of dignity in men who were so far from their homes. For a significant number of prisoners, their faith served as a comforting connection, alleviating their anxieties and reminding them of their humanity, rather than simply seeing themselves as mere numbers in the context of war. Communication through letters served as a crucial connection to the outside world. Despite the censorship, the exchange of letters with their families enabled the prisoners to maintain ties with their homeland. Certain letters contained descriptions of bombings in Naples or resource scarcity in Rome, portraying a country grappling with the dual challenges of Allied attacks and the crumbling regime of Mussolini. Upon reading these letters, the prisoners frequently experienced conflicting emotions, including guilt for their relative safety and adequate food supply in America, alongside relief that they had managed to survive. They began to realize that their families back home would likely find it hard to believe their accounts of acceptable treatment, comfortable living quarters, and even the availability of opportunities for learning and leisure. During peaceful evenings, as they gathered outside their living quarters, the Italian prisoners would exchange hushed conversations about the surreal nature of their circumstances. While the war continued to rage in other parts of the world, their life in America felt almost shielded, cultured, and remarkably compassionate. Although it was undeniably captivity, it also represented an unforeseen act of grace that reshaped their perceptions of who the true adversary was. As America faced a significant labor shortage during the war, the Italian prisoners of war found themselves unexpectedly called upon to work on farms located in the Midwest and South. Initially, a considerable number of the prisoners braced themselves for potential exploitation, anticipating treatment akin to slaves under constant surveillance. However, they were pleasantly surprised to discover that their work was systematically organized, properly compensated, and even appreciated by the local farmers who were in desperate need of assistance. From the cornfields of Iowa to the cotton farms of Texas, the Italian prisoners of war played a critical role in American agriculture throughout the war years. Each morning, groups of prisoners were escorted from the camps, transported by trucks, and taken to nearby farms. With only minimal supervision, they engaged in tasks such as harvesting crops, repairing fences, and caring for livestock. The farmers soon came to understand that many of these individuals had grown up in rural Italy and possessed inherent skills in the ways of agricultural life. They exhibited competence in handling plows, harvesting fruits, and managing animals. Over time, the dynamic between the farmers and the prisoners evolved from one of distrust to one of collaboration, and in many cases, even mutual respect. Perhaps the most unexpected revelation occurred when the farmers treated the prisoners with a sense of neighborly kindness, rather than with disdain. Water pitchers were passed around in the open fields, protection from the sun was found under barns, and occasionally when the workday ended, meals were made by the farmers' wives, who insisted that the men sit at the table together with the family. The Italians, who were ready for unkindness, felt as though they were transported to another world, as they sat in an American farmhouse kitchen and ate things like cornbread, beans, or even homemade pie. Such hospitality from an enemy nation was beyond anything they could have imagined. Many had clear recollections of small acts of kindness: a farmer secretly placing a cigarette in a prisoner's hand, a kid giving an apple, or a woman putting extra bread in a bag before the men were taken back to the camp. The dividing line between prisoner and guest blurred because of these instances. For the Italians, who came from a society struggling with shortages, such generosity seemed unrealistic. Even the guards who were there to keep watch over them often became more relaxed in these rural locations, allowing easygoing discussions and laughter between the locals and prisoners. The work was far from easy. The men were worn out from the long hours spent under the sun, but the physical difficulties were lessened by the simple honor of being helpful. The act of working the land gave a renewed sense of purpose to men who had felt helpless during the chaotic times of war. Some later wrote in their memoirs about discovering a different side of America in those fields. It wasn't the America that was shown in propaganda, but instead one made up of hard-working and kind everyday people, who treated them more like neighbors than enemies. The farmers were also taken by surprise. Instead of the cruel and dangerous hardened fascists they anticipated, they instead encountered ordinary young men from towns that were similar to their own. They were sons, fathers, and brothers, who were trapped in an unwanted war. Even though some did not speak much English, gestures, broken words, and shared meals were more effective at building connections than language. Even after the war, some friendships remained, with letters being sent across the Atlantic, long after the men went back to Italy. By the time the harvest seasons had gone by, the Italian prisoners of war had not only filled an important need in the wartime economy of America, but they had also gathered experiences that would shock their families when they returned home. They had been welcomed into kitchens, treated as men, and shown kindness in the most unexpected places while they were prisoners. The memories of regular American families, not the camps themselves, were among the most lasting that Italian prisoners took back across the Atlantic. It was genuinely surprising for men who had thought their captors would distance themselves to discover that people frequently treated them with kindness and warmth. These moments became cherished memories that were quietly told in barracks and then recounted to children and grandchildren following the war. Families inevitably came into contact with the prisoners when farm work took them outside of the camp's boundaries. Some people were initially cautious, having doubts that these Italians might still be loyal to Mussolini or Hitler. However, curiosity frequently won over fear, and soon bonds started to form. The wives of farmers would bring refreshing lemonade out to the fields, beckoning the tired men to enjoy a drink. Children, intrigued by the unfamiliar accents of these newcomers, would sometimes trail behind them, posing questions or sharing pieces of candy. The security personnel, perceiving no threat in these interactions, generally permitted them. These modest acts gradually eroded the perception of America as a heartless, unforgiving adversary. Accounts circulated of entire families inviting prisoners to join them at their dining tables for Sunday meals. Down south, Italian prisoners of war were amazed by abundant servings of fried chicken, biscuits, and delicious pies. In the Midwest, they sampled corn on the cob and hearty stews, dishes they were unfamiliar with but found deeply comforting. For these men so distant from their homes, the welcoming atmosphere felt almost dreamlike. Sharing meals with civilians blurred the distinction between wartime and peacetime, reminding them of the normalcy of everyday life. Many later admitted that they felt treated not so much like prisoners, but more like distant relatives who were just passing through. Certain families went even further, offering small presents, spare clothing, books, or musical instruments. One memorable story recounted a farmer who presented a violin to a young Italian prisoner who had once played in his village orchestra back in Italy. This man would play in the evenings at the camp, and both the prisoners and guards would gather to listen, momentarily escaping the confines of the fences and the conflict. Such acts of generosity profoundly impacted men who had previously believed they were despised enemies. Friendships began to flourish. Farmers occasionally corresponded with the prisoners' relatives through letters that were sent via authorized channels, reassuring them that their sons or husbands were receiving good treatment. In return, Italian families expressed their gratitude, amazed to hear of the kindness shown across enemy lines. A few of these relationships persisted long after the war ended, with letters exchanged for many years, demonstrating how brief encounters could leave enduring impressions. The prisoners of war also realized that American families were curious about them. Locals inquired about life in Italy, asking about villages, churches, and customs. Some prisoners proudly described their hometowns, vineyards, and olive groves, creating images of a life very different from the fascist propaganda. These exchanges gave the Italians a human face, transforming them from anonymous adversaries into individuals with stories that were not so different from those of their hosts. By the time many prisoners returned to camp at the close of long days of labor, they carried with them not only physical exhaustion, but also a strange, unexpected warmth. They had been seen, spoken to, and even fed by people who should have regarded them solely as enemies. That sense of shared humanity would remain with them long after the war. It was a reminder that even in the midst of conflict, kindness could emerge in the most unlikely of places. For men who had grown up under Mussolini's fascist rule, America had always been depicted as a decaying, soulless society that was corrupted by money and excess. Yet beyond the boundaries of the camps and in the towns where they worked, Italian prisoners of war began to perceive a completely different reality. The aspect that astounded them most was not only the abundance of resources, but also the vibrant cultural atmosphere that seemed to permeate every aspect of America. Inside the confines of the camps, moments of respite often occurred during the evenings. American music was broadcasted on the radio, including swing bands, jazz orchestras, and singers like Bing Crosby. These sounds seemed completely unfamiliar to men who were accustomed to military hymns and folk melodies. Initially, some individuals chuckled at the unfamiliar rhythms, uncertain about how to interpret this music that appeared to dance in contrast to their marching music. However, the melodies soon became ingrained in their memories. Some even attempted to hum along, amazed by the fact that the enemy's culture could evoke feelings of joy, lightheartedness, and profound humanity. For a considerable number of individuals, this marked the initial instance of questioning the propaganda that had portrayed American life as superficial and morally bankrupt. Movies emerged as another source of revelation. The U.S. Army occasionally arranged movie nights, showcasing Hollywood productions in makeshift theaters within the camps. Italians flocked into barracks transformed into cinemas to view comedies, westerns, and dramas. Charlie Chaplin's humorous acts elicited universal laughter, while tales of cowboy adventures captivated men who had been raised on entirely distinct traditional narratives. They observed not a culture characterized by weakness, but rather one imbued with imagination, humor, and optimism. The very act of being permitted to watch films, entertainment provided to prisoners, was in itself an unanticipated act of kindness. Religious freedom introduced yet another element of astonishment. In fascist Italy, Catholicism held a dominant position in public life, but it was subject to state oversight. In America, the Italian prisoners of war, POWs, observed a remarkable diversity in religious practices. Protestant chaplains occasionally visited the camps, and Catholic priests conducted Mass with the prisoners. No one prohibited prayer or demanded oaths of allegiance to Mussolini or Hitler. For some men, this tolerance was perplexing. For others, it was liberating, serving as a reminder that faith could flourish independently of political interference. Outside the boundaries of the camps, On farms and in small towns, cultural interactions intensified. Some Americans imparted rudimentary English phrases to the prisoners, gently chuckling at their mispronunciations. In exchange, the Italians shared songs or stories originating from their villages. Children in particular delighted in acquiring simple Italian words, repeating them with laughter. These interactions were modest yet impactful, gradually diminishing the barrier between enemy and guest. Not every experience was devoid of concerns. Instances of tension did arise. Occasional disputes among prisoners occurred, dividing those loyal to the fascist regime from those disillusioned with it. Yet even these divisions revealed something significant. America provided room for disagreement, for individuality even within the confines of imprisonment. It presented a stark contrast to the conformity mandated by fascist rule back in their homeland. For the Italians, perhaps the most profound cultural revelation was the simple sense of freedom that seemed to permeate American life, even from within the confines of the fences. They observed farming families engaging in their daily routines without fear of secret police, residing in homes untouched by the ravages of war. They witnessed young Americans, many of them guards scarcely older than themselves, joking, reading newspapers, and formulating plans for the future with a confidence that seemed alien to them. It was not the America of corruption and moral decay that fascist radio had warned them about. It was a land where ordinary individuals appeared to live with dignity and a sense of possibility. As the months went by, the Italian POWs started to realize they would take these memories back home. What affected them most, besides food and shelter, was understanding that American culture was not weak but full of strength, compassion, and a liveliness that their own leaders had consistently denied. In the war's closing years, whispers about peace and rumors regarding their return began to spread within the Italian camps in America. The thought of returning home filled the men who had crossed an ocean as prisoners with both comfort and anxiety. They yearned for their families, their towns, and their homeland, which had been damaged by years of fighting. However, they were also aware that they would be leaving behind an experience so remarkable and unlike anything they had imagined that few people back in Italy would actually believe it. With the end of the war in Europe in the spring of 1945, the process of sending prisoners back home commenced. The Italian POWs gathered their possessions, letters, handmade items, and sometimes even small presents given to them by farmers or guards. For many, leaving was a mix of happiness and sadness. They had survived being prisoners with respect and even kindness, and the thought of returning to a ruined Italy weighed on them. They boarded trains that took them back to ports like Newport News or New York, passing through the American landscape once more. They saw neat towns, expansive farms, and cities filled with industries that had not been touched by bombs. Some silently looked out the windows, realizing how much they had come to admire America. The trip across the Atlantic was different this time. They were no longer enemy prisoners under suspicion, but men being freed from an unexpected part of their lives. On the decks of the ships, groups of Italians recalled the farms where they had worked, the families who had been kind to them, and the music and movies that had made their time as prisoners better. They wondered how they would explain these stories when they got back. Would anyone believe that Americans had welcomed them into their homes, shared food with them, and even treated them like guests? When they finally arrived at Italian ports, the contrast was striking. The homeland they came back to was bombed, hungry, and divided. Cities like Naples and Rome showed signs of war, while rural villages struggled with poverty and scarcity. Many returning POWs felt guilty. How could they describe their well-fed, orderly time in America to families who had suffered years of hardship? Some chose to remain silent, while others, unable to hide the truth, cautiously shared that they had been treated well. Those who spoke openly were often met with disbelief. Relatives expected stories of cruelty and starvation, but instead heard stories of good living conditions, medical attention, and American generosity. In a country still struggling with defeat and shame, such stories seemed almost like betrayal. Yet the men who had experienced it knew it was true. They held distinct recollections of tables on farms overflowing with cuisine, children handing out sweets, and evenings filled with musical entertainment on radios that aired joy and melodies instead of biased information. Readjusting to the familiar rhythm of Italian life proved to be a challenge. In a devastated economic landscape, numerous veterans encountered obstacles in securing employment, and some faced skepticism for their status as prisoners rather than celebrated heroes. However, beneath the surface of these adversities resided an undeniable reality. They had caught a glimpse of an alternative realm, where even adversaries were capable of exhibiting compassion. This memory evolved into a subtle reservoir of strength, an attribute they would retain throughout their remaining years. As Italy navigated the ambiguous period following 1945, the narratives brought home by ex-prisoners of war gently circulated through communities. Individuals who had toiled on American farms or resided in efficiently managed camps found themselves sharing recollections that contradicted the prolonged indoctrination of fascist propaganda in communal gatherings and local coffee shops. They recounted tales of plentiful provisions, freely accessible health care, guards who upheld order without resorting to brutality, and American families who embraced them into their homes as if they were distant relatives. These accounts presented a challenge for numerous Italians to embrace. The war had left the nation in ruins, food supplies were scarce, and animosity towards former enemies was pervasive. How could it be plausible that the very Americans who had bombarded their cities had also extended kindness to their captured sons? Nevertheless, as an increasing number of men returned with analogous stories, the impact of these narratives began to reshape perceptions. For a nation exhausted by authoritarian rule and devastation, the notion that the enemy could also demonstrate humanity served as a foundation for reconciliation. While it did not eradicate resentment or suffering, it introduced complexity to the portrayal of America that had been propagated for decades by Mussolini's government. Progressively, it fostered an environment in which Italians could commence perceiving the United States not merely as an occupying force, but as a prospective collaborator in reconstruction. During the initial stages of the Cold War, as Italy grappled with political instability between communist movements and pro-Western factions, these individual recollections held significance beyond what officials recognized. Former prisoners of war who had collaborated with American farmers spoke at town meetings, in veterans organizations, and even during political debates, providing evidence that America possessed not only strength, but also empathy. Their voices lent credibility to the concept of closer alliances with the West. As the Marshall Plan initiated the provision of aid to Italy, numerous individuals who had once been prisoners of war recognized familiar virtues: practical generosity, material abundance, and a dedication to rebuilding rather than imposing penalties. On a more intimate level, these men transitioned into storytellers for a new generation. To children born in the latter part of the 1940s and the early 1950s, fathers and uncles depicted the peculiar era when captivity across the ocean had proven to be safer and more benevolent than freedom within their own nation. They reminisced about the flavor of cornbread and beans, the melodies of jazz emanating from the radio, and the amusement of American children attempting to imitate Italian pronunciations. These narratives, imbued with a sentimental longing for the past, portrayed the previous adversary as relatable and tempered the intensity of wartime animosity. Academics would eventually recognize that this surge of recollections had a tacit influence in solidifying Italy's position within the group of Western nations. Extending beyond formal agreements and political dealings, the personal encounters of countless average troops were instrumental in transforming Italy's perception of the United States. Their endurance had been shaped not by harshness, but by unforeseen benevolence. And in the hushed recounting of those events, a connection was established. As the years turned into decades, a considerable number of these individuals had aged, but their memories persisted. During gatherings or within personal accounts, they focused less on the conflicts they had been defeated in, and more on the generosity they had been shown. For these individuals, the profound revelation of being held captive was not the loss itself, but the realization that kindness could be present even amongst those considered foes. And as they passed down these accounts to their descendants, they bequeathed a heritage characterized not by resentment, but by thankfulness, emphasizing that the most impactful triumphs occasionally arise not from armed conflict, but from straightforward acts of empathy.